The sun was setting over the highway, streaking the sky in hues of orange and pink. Traffic was light, just a few cars scattered along the long stretch of road. Angela Davis drove calmly in her sleek black sedan, soft music playing through the speakers. She was heading home after a long day of meetings at the courthouse. Dressed in a tailored suit, she looked every bit the professional she was, but tonight she just wanted to relax. In her rearview mirror, she noticed a police cruiser slowly approaching. She didn't think much of it at first. She wasn't speeding, and her car was in perfect order. But then the flashing lights came on. Angela sighed quietly and signaled to pull over onto the shoulder. She stopped the car, shifted it into park, and rolled down the window halfway. A tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out of the cruiser. His nameplate read Officer Miller. His face was stern, his stride deliberate. He stopped beside her window and leaned slightly, his tone already sharp. License and registration. Angela handed them over calmly. "Of course, officer. May I ask why I was pulled over?" Miller barely glanced at the documents. "I'll ask the questions. You answer. Got it?" Angela tilted her head slightly. "I'd still like to know the reason for the stop." The officer smirked. "You look suspicious. Driving this kind of car in this neighborhood. Mind telling me where you're really headed?" Angela's eyes remained steady. "I'm heading home. I had a long day at work." Miller chuckled, but it wasn't friendly. "Work? Sure. What kind of work puts you in a luxury car like this?" "Legal work," Angela replied simply. He leaned closer, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "What are you, a secretary for some big lawyer or something?" Angela stayed calm. "Something like that." Miller stepped back slightly and circled the car slowly, peering through the windows. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle? I need to make sure everything checks out." Angela exhaled, unbuckling her seatbelt. She stepped out, standing tall in her heels, her presence composed but commanding. Miller eyed her carefully. "So what's in the trunk? You carrying something you shouldn't be?" "No," Angela said evenly. "And unless you have probable cause, you're not searching it." The officer's smirk widened. "You seem to know a lot about the law. Did you Google your rights before you got in the car?" Angela folded her arms gently. "Actually, I know my rights quite well." Miller narrowed his eyes. "Yeah? And why's that?" Angela met his stare without flinching. "Because I'm the state attorney." For a moment, Miller blinked, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. And in that instant, the balance of power shifted completely. For a moment, the highway seemed to fall silent. The distant hum of cars faded as Officer Miller stared at Angela, trying to process what she had just said. "State attorney?" he repeated slowly, his confident smirk faltering. "Yes," Angela replied calmly, her voice steady. "Angela Davis. I'm the state attorney for this district. You might want to think very carefully about your next words and actions." Miller's jaw tightened. He glanced at her suit again, noticing the polished badge clipped discreetly to her belt, the one he hadn't bothered to see before. For a split second, his composure cracked, but instead of backing down gracefully, he forced a laugh. "Well, ma'am, you could have just said that from the start." Angela raised an eyebrow slightly. "And would that have changed the way you treated me just now?" Miller hesitated. "I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Angela's tone remained calm, but carried an unmistakable edge. Your job is to serve and protect, not to harass citizens based on assumptions about who they are or what they drive. Miller shifted uncomfortably. Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. I. No, Angela interrupted, her voice still measured, but sharper now. You pulled me over without cause. You made comments about where I belong. You implied suspicion because of the car I drive and the neighborhood I'm in. That is not a wrong foot. That's a violation of the oath you took. Miller's eyes darted to his cruiser, as if weighing whether to just end the stop and drive away. But he stayed rooted, realizing he couldn't simply erase what had just happened. Angela stepped closer, her heels clicking on the pavement with deliberate calm. Do you know how many reports cross my desk about stops like this? About officers abusing their authority in exactly this way? Too many. And I'm usually reading them as someone else's story. Today, I'm living it. Miller opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no quick retort this time. Angela reached into her bag slowly and pulled out her official identification. She held it up for him to see clearly. This is who I am. And I didn't need to show you this to deserve basic respect. A flicker of realization passed over Miller's face. This was no longer a routine stop he could brush aside. He was standing in front of the highest-ranking prosecutor in the state, someone with the power to hold him accountable. I didn't mean any disrespect, Miller muttered finally, his tone shifting from arrogance to unease. Angela didn't let him off so easily. Yes, you did, because you thought you could. And you need to understand, whether it's me or anyone else, your actions have consequences. The weight of her words hung in the air. Angela took a step back toward her car. I suggest you think about why you became an officer in the first place. Because this, she gestured between them, is not why you wear that badge. Miller swallowed hard. Are you going to file a complaint? Angela looked at him steadily. I don't need to threaten you with paperwork. The real question is whether you'll change before someone else's life is impacted more than mine was today. With that, she opened her car door, sliding back into the driver's seat with quiet dignity. Miller stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether to apologize again or simply retreat. He finally stepped back toward his cruiser, his earlier arrogance completely gone. As Angela drove away, the flashing lights of his patrol car dimmed into the distance. The encounter was over, but for Miller, the impact lingered. He had just seen the fine line between authority and abuse, and how easily it could crumble when faced with true integrity. Angela, meanwhile, drove on calmly, her expression unreadable. She had dealt with men like him before, and she knew she would again. But she also knew this. Every time someone like Miller was forced to face his own bias, a seed was planted. And some seeds, given time, grow into change. Angela continued down the highway, the sun dipping lower on the horizon. Her hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, her face calm, but her mind was turning over the encounter in quiet reflection. She had been in countless courtrooms where stories like this unfolded. She had seen the paperwork, the reports, the excuses, but living it firsthand always left a sharper sting. Back on the roadside, Officer Miller sat in his cruiser, staring at the steering wheel. The silence inside the car was deafening. He replayed the moment she said the words, "State Attorney," feeling the way the ground shifted beneath him. He had thought he held all the power during that stop, but the truth had stripped his authority bare, leaving him with nothing but his own reflection. His radio crackled with routine chatter, but he didn't respond. For the first time in a long time, he was questioning his own instincts. Meanwhile, Angela exited the highway and turned onto a quiet city street lined with trees. She pulled into a parking space outside a community center where she had promised to stop by for an evening legal outreach session. Inside, a small group of residents waited for her. They greeted her warmly, unaware of what had just happened on her way there. Angela smiled, straightened her suit jacket, and stepped into the room with the same grace she always carried. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "Tonight, we're going to talk about your rights during traffic stops, interactions with law enforcement, and how to protect yourselves legally if you ever feel those rights are violated." The irony wasn't lost on her. Just an hour earlier, she had needed those same rights. As the session went on, people asked questions, some nervous, some angry, all searching for reassurance. Angela answered patiently, reminding them that knowing the law was their strongest defense. Back on patrol, Miller drove aimlessly through the quiet streets. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness of how easily his authority could have ended his career in a single moment. He thought about the way Angela had looked at him, not with hatred, but with a calm disappointment that cut deeper than anger. At the community center, the session wrapped up. A young woman approached Angela privately. "I was pulled over last week," she said softly. "I felt so powerless, but hearing you speak, it helps to know someone like you is in our corner." Angela placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're never powerless when you know your rights. And remember, your dignity is yours. No one can take it unless you let them." Later that night, Angela returned home to her quiet apartment. She set down her bag, poured herself a cup of tea, and sat by the window. She thought of Miller again. She could have taken his badge with a single call. She could have filed a report that would follow him for the rest of his career. But she also knew change didn't always come through punishment. Sometimes, the most powerful lesson was the one someone carried silently after being exposed to the truth. Across town, Miller parked his cruiser and sat in the dark for a long time before heading home. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the enforcer. He felt like the one who had been judged, and rightly so. Angela sipped her tea, her face serene. She knew tomorrow would bring another courtroom, another meeting, another fight for justice, and she would face it the same way she always did, with quiet strength, unwavering in the belief that dignity could outlast ignorance. The stop was over, but its impact would ripple far beyond that stretch of highway. Because some lessons aren't loud, they echo in silence. The next morning, Angela arrived at her downtown office. The building was already busy, with clerks and attorneys preparing for the day's cases. She walked through the familiar halls, exchanging calm nods with colleagues who respected her quiet authority. She slipped into her office, setting her bag down beside her desk. As she organized her files for an upcoming meeting, her phone buzzed with a message from a staff member. "Angela, there's been an inquiry from the police department. An officer reported a stop with you yesterday. Do you want to address it?" Angela stared at the message for a moment. She hadn't expected Miller to voluntarily mention it. She typed back simply, "No formal action needed. Just note it for the record." Meanwhile, Miller sat in a cramped briefing room at the precinct. He wasn't himself. His usual bravado was replaced by a distracted silence that didn't go unnoticed. Another officer leaned over and asked, "You okay? You've been quiet all morning." Miller hesitated. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking." "About what?" Miller didn't answer. How could he explain that in the span of 10 minutes on a highway shoulder, he'd been stripped of the illusion that his badge gave him control over every situation? Across town, Angela prepared for a meeting with community leaders about improving relations with law enforcement. She couldn't help but think about the irony. How she was discussing systemic change while still experiencing the very bias they were trying to address. When the meeting began, one community member asked, "What do we do when officers don't respect the law themselves?" Angela took a measured breath. "We hold them accountable, but we also remind them, and everyone, that respect isn't conditional. It's the standard. And even when it's not given to you, you don't have to give up your own." Her words carried a quiet strength that resonated deeply in the room. Later that day, Miller drove through the same stretch of highway where he had pulled Angela over. He slowed as he passed the exact spot. The memory of her calm gaze returned, sharper than any reprimand could have been. For the first time, he questioned the moments before every stop he had made in the past. How many times had he assumed? How many times had he spoken with the same tone he had used with her? That evening, Angela returned home. She placed her files on the counter and made herself a cup of tea. She didn't dwell on the incident. It was one of many, and it would not derail her purpose. But she did hope, in a quiet way, that Officer Miller would carry the weight of that day forward. Not as shame, but as a seed of change. Because true accountability wasn't about destruction. It was about transformation. And sometimes, one silent moment was enough to begin it. The following day, Angela was in court handling a high-profile case. She stood before the judge with calm precision, presenting her arguments with the confidence of someone who knew the law inside and out. Her colleagues watched with quiet admiration, reminded again why she held the highest legal office in the state. But in the back of her mind, the roadside encounter still lingered. Not because of the insult, but because it was proof of how deeply ingrained bias could be. Even her title, her accomplishments, and her authority hadn't shielded her from a split-second judgment made by someone in uniform. Meanwhile, Officer Miller was back at the precinct, staring at a stack of incident reports. He couldn't concentrate. Every time he tried to push the memory aside, Angela's steady voice echoed in his mind, "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with basic respect." For the first time in his career, he found himself questioning his own motivations. How many stops had he made where he let his assumptions guide his tone? How many people had walked away from him feeling humiliated, powerless, and unseen? During a lunch break, one of his fellow officers joked about pulling over the wrong person. Miller didn't laugh. He simply said, "Maybe there shouldn't be a wrong person. Maybe we're just doing it wrong." His colleague gave him a puzzled look, but Miller didn't explain further. Across town, Angela met with a group of young law students after her court session. They had invited her to speak about her career path, but the conversation shifted when one of them asked, "Have you ever been treated unfairly, even as someone in your position?" Angela hesitated, then answered honestly, "Yes, just this week, in fact." The students were surprised. "What did you do?" "I stayed calm," Angela said, "because reacting in anger doesn't change hearts. But staying firm, holding your dignity, that leaves a mark they can't forget." Later that afternoon, Miller parked his cruiser near a quiet park. He watched families walking, children playing. For the first time in years, he really saw the people around him, not as potential suspects or statistics, but as lives with their own stories. He thought about Angela again. Not the title, not the power she held, but the way she never raised her voice. The way she made him feel the weight of his actions without yelling, without threatening. That evening, Angela returned home to her quiet apartment. She placed her files neatly on her desk and made herself a cup of tea. Looking out the window at the city lights, she allowed herself a brief moment of peace. She didn't know what Miller would do with the lesson he'd been given, but she knew she hadn't wasted hers. Every encounter, even the difficult ones, was another reminder of why she fought so hard for justice, not just in courtrooms, but in everyday life. And for Miller, the silence of his own conscience was louder than any reprimand could ever be. The next morning at the precinct, Officer Miller sat through the daily briefing, but his mind was elsewhere. The routine chatter of shift changes and patrol assignments felt distant. He couldn't shake the image of Angela standing calmly on the roadside, looking at him with a quiet authority that had stripped away every ounce of his arrogance. When the meeting ended, he stayed behind, staring at his notepad. He scribbled a few words, paused, then tore the page out. For the first time in his career, he wondered if he had been doing his job wrong all along. Later that day, Miller stopped by the department's small library and pulled out a binder on community relations training, a binder he had ignored for years. He leafed through it slowly, reading passages he had once dismissed as fluff. Across the city, Angela was in a meeting with state officials about improving law enforcement accountability. She presented clear proposals for mandatory bias training and better reporting systems. "This isn't about punishing officers," she explained to the room. "It's about making sure they understand the responsibility that comes with the power they're given. One interaction can destroy trust or build it." Her colleagues nodded in agreement. They admired the way she approached change, not with vengeance, but with a drive to fix what was broken at its roots. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Miller sat alone in the locker room. He thought about all the stops he had made over the years. He remembered the faces of the people he'd spoken to harshly, the way they'd shrink under his tone. He had told himself it was part of the job, but now he realized it had been part of him, a part he didn't want to carry anymore. That evening, Angela stopped at the community center again. She greeted a small group of residents gathered for a workshop on knowing their legal rights. One man spoke up, frustration in his voice. "We know our rights," he said, "but what do we do when the officers don't care about them?" Angela answered softly but firmly, "We keep holding them accountable, and we keep showing up. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with people who refuse to give up. After the session, Angela walked to her car under the soft glow of streetlights. She thought briefly of Miller, wondering if he was reflecting on his choices, or if he would just move on unchanged like so many before him. At that same moment, Miller was sitting in his cruiser, parked near a quiet street. He wasn't writing tickets or running plates. He was simply watching the people around him. Families walking, kids riding bikes, neighbors talking. For the first time, he saw them as more than random strangers passing through his shift. He took a deep breath, realizing that one encounter had forced him to see what he had ignored for years. Angela didn't know it yet, but the lesson she delivered in silence was already working its way through his conscience. And sometimes, change begins not with a loud reckoning, but with a quiet moment of clarity. The following morning, Angela arrived at the courthouse for another busy day. The building bustled with lawyers, clerks, and citizens seeking justice. As she stepped inside, her assistant handed her a folder. "Today's meeting with the governor's task force has been confirmed," the assistant said. "They want your input on the new statewide policing reforms." Angela nodded. "Good. It's time these conversations moved beyond words and into action." Meanwhile, at the precinct, Officer Miller sat quietly in the back of the roll call room as his sergeant discussed the day's patrol assignments. Usually, Miller would lean back with a casual air of superiority, but today he sat upright, taking everything in. When the sergeant mentioned a new round of community policing workshops, Miller surprised himself by raising his hand. "I'd like to attend," he said simply. The sergeant looked at him with mild surprise, but nodded. Noted. After the meeting, one of Miller's colleagues approached him. "Since when do you care about those workshops?" Miller hesitated, then replied, "Since I realized I've been seeing the badge as a shield instead of a responsibility." Across town, Angela was speaking to the governor's task force. She outlined practical steps for preventing discriminatory stops, mandatory bias awareness training, better oversight, and clearer accountability measures. "It only takes one unnecessary stop to break a citizen's trust in the system," Angela said. "But it also only takes one officer choosing to do better to start rebuilding that trust." The officials listened intently. They could feel the weight of her experience, not just as a leader, but as someone who had lived through the very injustice she was describing. Later that afternoon, Miller pulled over to a quiet gas station during his patrol. He watched as a young black teenager filled up an old sedan, looking nervous as a patrol car idled nearby. Normally, Miller might have walked over with his usual stern expression, asking unnecessary questions. But this time, he simply nodded to the boy with a neutral, calm look. The teenager's shoulders eased slightly as he realized there was no threat. It was a small moment, almost invisible, but Miller felt it. He was choosing differently now. That evening, Angela wrapped up her day and drove home. As she stopped at a traffic light, she glanced at the car beside her. A patrol cruiser sat there, its driver looking straight ahead. For a moment, she wondered if it was Miller. Across the city, Miller parked his cruiser after his shift ended. He sat in the driver's seat for a long while, thinking about the day. He thought about Angela again, how she had dismantled his arrogance without yelling, how she had left him with nothing but the truth to face. He knew he couldn't undo the stop, but he also knew he didn't want to be the officer who made people feel that way again. And for Angela, The stop was just one of many she'd endured. But even if Miller never reached out, she hoped the seed of change had been planted. Because real reform doesn't always start with a law. Sometimes it starts with one person finally seeing clearly. The next few days unfolded with quiet momentum. Angela's proposals for statewide policing reforms gained traction after her meeting with the governor's task force. Local news outlets began reporting on the initiative, highlighting her leadership in bringing practical solutions to long-standing issues. One article even featured her photo with the headline, "State Attorney Angela Davis Champions Trust Between Law Enforcement and Community." Angela didn't seek the attention, but she understood the importance of the message reaching people beyond courtrooms and conference rooms. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Officer Miller found himself thinking more deeply about his role. He attended the first of the community policing workshops, something he had once mocked as soft training. But as he sat through the session, listening to residents share their experiences with traffic stops and profiling, he felt a weight in his chest. A woman in the workshop said quietly, "It's not just the stop. It's how small it makes you feel, like you don't matter, like you're invisible unless you've done something wrong." Those words echoed Angela's calm voice in his mind. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with basic respect." When the session ended, Miller stayed behind, talking briefly with the facilitator. "I didn't realize how much we affect people with just a few words," he admitted. "I think I've been doing this wrong for a long time." Across town, Angela was back at the community center meeting with residents. A young man raised his hand and asked, "How do you keep your composure when someone disrespects you like that?" Angela smiled faintly. "Because losing your composure means giving them control of the moment, and I refuse to give that away. Dignity is something no one can take from you unless you let them." The young man nodded thoughtfully, clearly moved. Later that evening, Miller drove past the same stretch of highway where he had pulled Angela over. He slowed near the exact spot, the memory vivid. He imagined what could have happened if Angela had been someone without the title or power she held. Would he have written her a ticket just to prove a point? Would he have escalated the stop unnecessarily? He didn't like the answers. Angela, meanwhile, returned home after a long day. She poured herself a cup of tea and looked out at the city lights, thinking of all the people who didn't have the luxury of being heard when they were wronged. She knew her role gave her a platform, but her fight was for those whose voices weren't amplified. Miller parked his cruiser at the end of his shift and sat for a while before heading in. He wasn't sure yet how to undo the damage he had done in the past, but he was sure of one thing. He didn't want to be the same officer who had pulled Angela over that day. Two lives still connected by a single roadside encounter. One used it to create systemic change. The other was learning, slowly, how to change himself. The following morning, Angela sat in a meeting with her senior staff. They were reviewing the latest updates on the policing reforms, and for the first time, there was a sense of cautious optimism in the room. "Community feedback is already improving," one advisor noted. "People are starting to feel like their concerns are being heard." Angela nodded. "It's a start. But real change isn't measured in a week. It's measured in how consistent we are a year from now, 5 years from now." Meanwhile, Officer Miller stood in front of a small group of officers in a training session. This time, he wasn't just a passive participant. He raised his hand to speak. "I made a stop recently that opened my eyes," he said slowly. "I realized how easy it is to forget the humanity of the person in front of you. I don't want to be that kind of officer anymore." The room was quiet. Some officers nodded, others looked uncomfortable. But the words hung in the air heavier than any lecture. Across town, Angela spent her afternoon visiting a youth mentorship program she had quietly funded. The teens gathered around her, curious and eager to ask questions. "Is it hard standing up to people in power?" one young girl asked. Angela smiled gently. "It can be. But the truth is, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply not let someone else's behavior define yours. Staying calm is its own strength." Meanwhile, Miller was on patrol again. He stopped at a crosswalk where a woman struggled to push a stroller up a curb. Without hesitation, he got out and helped her. She looked surprised, offering a quiet "thank you." It was a small gesture, almost insignificant, but for Miller, it felt like a step in a different direction, a reminder that his badge could be used to serve, not intimidate. Later that evening, Angela attended a private dinner with community leaders and policy makers. As they discussed long-term strategies, one leader said, "Angela, you've shown us that change doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it starts with a single quiet act that forces people to see differently." Angela sipped her tea and nodded. "It's not about proving someone wrong. It's about giving them the chance to be better next time." Across the city, Miller ended his shift and sat in his parked cruiser for a moment of stillness. He thought again about Angela, about her calm words and the way she had dismantled his arrogance without ever raising her voice. He didn't know if he'd ever see her again, but he knew he'd never forget her. Angela returned home late that night. She stood by her window, looking at the glow of the city lights. She wasn't thinking about Miller specifically anymore. She was thinking about the thousands of other encounters like hers, the ones that didn't make headlines, the ones no one ever knew about. And she silently promised herself she'd keep fighting for those people. Because one changed heart might not fix everything, but it could be the spark that starts the fire. The next day, Angela arrived at the governor's office for a scheduled briefing. The room was filled with state officials, law enforcement leaders, and community advocates. They were reviewing the first draft of new guidelines for traffic stops and community policing. Angela spoke clearly and firmly. "We cannot allow bias, conscious or unconscious, to dictate how law enforcement engages with citizens. If we want trust, we have to build it, not demand it." Her words carried weight. No one in the room questioned her authority on the matter. Meanwhile, Miller walked through the precinct with a different demeanor than before. He noticed things he hadn't before: the tense expressions on certain citizens waiting in the lobby, the way some officers carried themselves with quiet superiority. He had been one of them, but now those small signs made him uneasy. He sat down with a colleague who had a reputation for being harsh during stops. "Do you ever think about how we talk to people?" Miller asked. The colleague shrugged. "It's just part of the job. You have to keep control." Miller stared at him for a moment. "Or maybe we just tell ourselves that so we don't have to admit we're wrong." The colleague gave him a puzzled look, but said nothing. Across town, Angela was at the community center again. After her meeting, A young mother approached her with a toddler in her arms. "Miss Davis," she said softly, "thank you for what you're doing. My brother was stopped unfairly last year. It didn't escalate, but it left a scar. Knowing someone in your position cares enough to make changes, it means more than you know." Angela smiled warmly. "You're welcome. Change is slow, but it's coming." Later that afternoon, Miller attended another community workshop voluntarily. This time, he listened more than he spoke. He heard stories from people who had been pulled over for no reason, people who were treated like criminals for simply existing in the wrong neighborhood. Each story felt like a mirror reflecting his own past actions. When the workshop ended, Miller walked out quietly. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of responsibility in a way that wasn't tied to enforcing the law, but to living it with integrity. That evening, Angela returned home after a long day. She made her usual cup of tea and sat by her window. She thought about all the reforms being set in motion, all the small victories that were adding up. Across the city, Miller sat in his cruiser at the end of his shift. He didn't turn on the radio or check his phone. He just sat there in silence, staring at his own reflection in the windshield. He didn't know if Angela would ever know the impact she had on him, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't the same officer he was before that stop. And Angela, without even trying, had forced him to see the difference between authority and true justice. The following morning, Angela attended a televised press conference to update the public on the new policing guidelines being drafted. Reporters filled the room, cameras clicking as she stepped to the podium. "Yesterday's policies won't fix today's problems," she said firmly. "We need law enforcement that understands their duty is to serve, not to intimidate. And that starts with accountability and education, not just for officers, but for the entire system." Her words made headlines within hours. Commentators praised her clarity and calmness, noting how her leadership style was reshaping the conversation around trust between communities and the police. Meanwhile, Miller was back on patrol, but his approach had shifted. A routine call about a suspicious vehicle came through his radio. Normally, he would have approached the scene with immediate suspicion, but this time he slowed his steps, observing first before jumping to conclusions. When he spoke to the driver, his tone was measured, respectful. The driver, a middle-aged man, visibly relaxed after realizing this wasn't going to be another hostile encounter. For Miller, it was a small but meaningful step, a reminder that his badge didn't give him the right to assume, but the responsibility to protect. Across town, Angela visited a local school where she had been invited to speak to a group of students about careers in law. She shared her journey. But when one student asked if she ever faced injustice herself, Angela paused. "Yes," she said softly. "Even in my position, I've been underestimated and disrespected. But here's what I want you to remember. The way someone treats you says more about them than it ever will about you. Never let their judgment dim your own worth." The students nodded, some taking notes, others simply absorbing the weight of her words. Later that day, Miller attended a voluntary training session at the precinct. This one focused on empathy in policing. As the instructor played recordings of citizens describing their fear during traffic stops, Miller felt a knot tighten in his chest. He thought again about Angela's calm but piercing words on the roadside. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with basic respect." When the session ended, The instructor asked if anyone wanted to share. Miller raised his hand slowly. "I've been on the other side of this," he admitted, "and I was wrong. I want to do better." Back at Angela's office, she wrapped up her work for the day. She placed her files neatly in her bag and looked out the large window overlooking the courthouse. She didn't know how many lives her words would touch, but she trusted that every step forward mattered. That evening, as the city lights glowed softly, Angela drove past the same stretch of highway where the incident had begun. She didn't slow down. She didn't need to. And across the city, Miller sat in his parked cruiser at the end of his shift, staring quietly into the night. He felt a shift inside himself, small but real. A single encounter had changed them both in different ways. The next morning, Angela walked into her office earlier than usual. She liked the quiet before the courthouse came alive with noise and urgency. She brewed herself a cup of coffee and opened the latest reports on policing reform. Slowly but surely, change was beginning to take shape. Small shifts in policies, improved community outreach, and a noticeable reduction in complaints in districts that had started new training initiatives. Across town, Miller pulled into the precinct parking lot. He sat in his cruiser for a few minutes before heading in. The building was the same as it had always been, but to him, it felt different now. Every day he walked through those doors, he carried the weight of that roadside encounter with Angela, and it reminded him to think twice before acting. Later that day, Angela attended a meeting with local community leaders. A woman from the neighborhood raised a concern about traffic stops in lower-income areas. "People are still scared," the woman said. "Even if they've done nothing wrong, there's always that fear." Angela nodded thoughtfully. That fear doesn't vanish overnight. It takes consistent action and consistent accountability to earn trust back. That's what we're working toward, step by step. Meanwhile, Miller was assigned to a community outreach event. He didn't volunteer for it, but this time he didn't treat it like an inconvenience. He listened as residents shared their concerns, and for the first time, he didn't dismiss them as complaints. He actually heard them. One older man approached Miller cautiously. "I've lived here 40 years, the man said. "It's rare for an officer to even look me in the eye and listen. So, thank you for at least doing that." Miller nodded. "You deserve that much. Everyone does." Back at the courthouse, Angela wrapped up her meeting and headed toward her car. She was met by a young reporter who had been following her work on reform. "State Attorney Davis," the reporter asked, "people are calling you the driving force behind a new era of community trust. How does it feel knowing your leadership is making such an impact?" Angela smiled softly. "It's not about me. It's about the people who've been waiting too long to feel safe and respected. I'm just making sure their voices are finally heard." That evening, Miller drove through a quiet neighborhood as the sun set. He saw kids playing on the sidewalks, families gathered on porches. It struck him that these were the same people he had once seen as routine stops or suspicious activity. Now, they felt human to him in a way they hadn't before. Angela arrived home later that night, setting her bag down and pouring herself a cup of tea. She sat by the window, gazing out at the lights of the city. She didn't know where Miller was or what choices he would continue to make, but she hoped her calm defiance had left a mark that would ripple outward. And in that quiet, both of them, one knowingly, one unknowingly, continued down paths forever changed by a single moment on the side of the road. The following morning, Angela received an email from a police captain she had worked with on past initiatives. The subject line read, "Request for collaboration." The message was direct. "We're seeing positive responses from the new training sessions. I'd like you to speak directly to our officers about why this matters from a community perspective. Hearing it from you would have more impact than any manual or slideshow ever could." Angela leaned back in her chair for a moment. She knew the request was significant. Inviting the state attorney to speak directly to officers wasn't common. After a brief pause, she typed her reply. "I'll do it. Let's set a date." Meanwhile, at the precinct, Miller sat in the briefing room, listening as the sergeant reminded everyone about the upcoming mandatory community workshop. A few officers groaned under their breath, but Miller didn't. He'd stopped seeing these sessions as a burden. After the briefing, one younger officer approached him. "Miller, is it true you're taking all this new training stuff seriously now? What changed?" Miller hesitated before answering. "Let's just say I met someone who reminded me what this badge is supposed to stand for. It's easy to forget if you're not careful." Across town, Angela spent her afternoon at the courthouse. She finalized a case that had been dragging on for months and then met with a small group of law students shadowing her for the day. "Law isn't just about statutes and arguments," she told them. "It's about people. Real lives are shaped by the choices we make in positions of power. Never lose sight of that." The students listened intently, taking notes. One of them asked, "How do you stay calm when people in power disrespect you?" Angela gave a soft smile. "Because I know who I am. Their actions can't define me unless I let them." Later that day, Miller drove his cruiser along a familiar route. As he passed the same stretch of highway where he had pulled Angela over, he slowed unconsciously. The memory came back vividly. The flashing lights, her steady gaze, the moment his authority dissolved. He parked for a moment on the shoulder, just as he had that day. But now he saw the space differently. It wasn't just a roadside. It was the place where his perspective had shifted, where the shield of his badge no longer felt invincible, but heavy with responsibility. That evening, Angela returned home, exhausted but fulfilled. She poured a cup of tea and stepped onto her balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She thought about the slow but steady change she was seeing. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. Across the city, Miller sat in the dim locker room after his shift. He didn't speak, didn't joke with the other officers like he used to. He was deep in thought, considering how he would move forward from the man he used to be. They were two very different lives, connected by one brief but powerful encounter. One building bridges for the future, the other learning, quietly, how to cross them. The day of Angela's scheduled talk at the police precinct arrived quickly. She prepared her notes in the morning, though she didn't intend to read from them much. She knew the most powerful words would be the ones that came naturally, spoken from experience. When she arrived at the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Rows of officers sat in the briefing room, some with arms crossed, others genuinely curious. Angela stepped to the front, calm and composed, her presence commanding the space without effort. "Thank you for inviting me," she began. "I'm not here to lecture you. I'm here because I've seen, firsthand, what happens when authority is used as a weapon instead of a shield. I felt it, and I know many in this community feel it every day. The room was quiet. Even those who had come in skeptical leaned forward slightly. Angela continued, "When you stop someone on the street or pull them over, you hold their safety, their dignity, and their trust in your hands. One careless word, one assumption, can shatter all of that. And when trust is broken, it takes years, sometimes generations, to rebuild." In the back of the room, Miller listened intently. Her words hit him harder than any reprimand ever had. She wasn't accusing. She was revealing a truth he could no longer ignore. Angela paused, then added softly, "Respect shouldn't depend on who someone is. It should be the standard you uphold for everyone, because you never know who you're really speaking to or what they carry with them." When she finished, the silence lingered for a moment before the room broke into polite applause. Some officers avoided her gaze, but others nodded thoughtfully. After the talk, a few officers approached her to ask questions. Miller stayed back, unsure if he should say anything. Eventually, he stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Ms. Davis," he said quietly, "thank you for coming. What you said, it matters." Angela met his eyes, recognizing him instantly. She gave a slight nod, but said nothing more. Miller understood. This wasn't about him seeking forgiveness. It was about what he did next. Later that day, Angela left the precinct, feeling cautiously hopeful. She knew not everyone in that room would change, but even planting doubt in their old ways was a start. Meanwhile, Miller returned to his patrol car and sat for a long while before starting his shift. He replayed her words in his head, especially the line about dignity and trust. For the first time, he felt the weight of the badge, something more than authority. It was a responsibility he couldn't take lightly anymore. That evening, Angela attended a community meeting where residents discussed their hopes for better policing. Listening to their voices reminded her why she kept pushing forward, because every small shift mattered. Across the city, Miller made a traffic stop that night, but instead of approaching with suspicion, he approached with patience. The driver looked relieved at his calm tone. It was a small step, but it was different. And sometimes, change begins with something that small. In the days following Angela's talk at the precinct, small but noticeable shifts began to ripple through the department. Officers who had once brushed off community concerns started to ask questions they'd never considered before. Even the tone of daily briefings felt different, less dismissive, more thoughtful. Miller, in particular, found himself changed. On patrol, he consciously slowed down his interactions. He greeted people respectfully, explained the reasons for stops clearly, and treated every driver as if they were someone who mattered, which he realized they were. It wasn't a grand transformation, but it was genuine. Meanwhile, Angela was invited to speak at a statewide law enforcement summit. There, she addressed a larger audience of police chiefs, legal professionals, and civic leaders. "Reform isn't about pointing fingers," she said calmly. "It's about reflection. It's about recognizing the moments we fail and choosing to do better the next time. Because when trust is lost between law enforcement and the community, everyone loses." Her words earned a standing ovation from some and quiet contemplation from others. She didn't need unanimous agreement. She only needed enough people willing to act. Back at the precinct, Miller sat in the locker room after his shift. One of the newer officers joined him and asked, "You've been different lately. What happened?" Miller stared at the floor for a moment before answering. "I met someone on a stop who reminded me what this badge is supposed to mean. I realized I wasn't living up to it." The younger officer nodded slowly. "Guess we all need that reminder sometimes." Across the city, Angela was working late in her office. She received an email update from the governor's task force. Her policy recommendations were moving forward. Soon, every officer in the state would be required to undergo regular bias awareness training. It wasn't everything, but it was progress. Later that evening, Miller parked his cruiser by the same highway shoulder where he had pulled Angela over. He sat there in silence, looking at the empty road. It was strange how one moment could change the trajectory of a person's life. Not just hers, but his as well. Angela, meanwhile, arrived home and set down her briefcase. She poured herself a cup of tea and stepped onto her balcony. The city lights twinkled softly, each one representing countless lives intertwined in ways unseen. She thought of Miller only briefly. She didn't need to know his journey. She only hoped he would carry the lesson forward. That night, two very different people sat in quiet reflection. One, a state attorney, steady in her purpose to create change. The other, a once arrogant officer, learning the weight of true responsibility, and though they would likely never cross paths again, the impact of their encounter lingered in every choice they made afterward. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons aren't loud. They live quietly in the space between who you were and who you choose to become. The following week, Angela stood before a room of community members and law enforcement officers gathered for a new pilot program on dialogue and trust building. The initiative had been sparked directly by her recent efforts. She opened with a simple truth. Every encounter between a citizen and an officer is a test of trust. Pass it, and you build a bridge. Fail it, and you build a wall. We need more bridges. The audience listened intently. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, while others nodded, knowing they had work to do. Meanwhile, Miller was in the back of that room, quietly observing. He had volunteered to attend. Normally, he would have avoided such programs, dismissing them as political theater. But now, his perspective was different. When the session moved to small group discussions, Miller joined a table with 3 residents. At first, there was hesitation. Then, one of the residents spoke. "I've been pulled over more times than I can count, always for looking suspicious. I still feel nervous every time I see a patrol car." Miller swallowed hard. He thought of Angela, of that night, and how he had made her feel. For the first time, he said the words he'd been avoiding. "I've been that officer, and I was wrong. I'm trying to do better now." The residents looked at him, surprised. One of them said softly, "Admitting it is the first step, but what matters is what you do next." Across town, Angela was finishing a long day at the courthouse. As she packed her files, her assistant shared a brief update. "People are talking about the changes. Officers are showing up to training sessions. It's slow, but it's happening." Angela smiled faintly. Real change is always slow, but slow is better than standing still. That evening, Miller was back on patrol. He pulled up to a car that had stopped on the roadside with a flat tire. A woman and her young son were struggling to change it. He got out of his cruiser, approached gently, and offered, "Need some help?" The woman looked up, startled at first, then nodded. "Yes, thank you." Miller spent 10 minutes helping them, talking kindly to the little boy as he worked. When he finished, the woman smiled. "I wasn't expecting that from an officer," she said. Miller gave a small nod. "It's what we should all be doing." Later that night, Angela returned home and sat on her balcony, sipping tea. She thought of the many unseen stories happening across the city, people choosing to do better, even in the smallest ways. And at the same time, Miller sat in his parked cruiser, staring at his reflection in the window. He wasn't proud of who he'd been, but for the first time, he felt hopeful about who he could become. Two lives, still separate, yet intertwined by one defining moment. Because real lessons don't end with an apology. They begin with what you do after it. The following morning, Angela attended another roundtable with state officials and community leaders. The topic was building long-term trust between citizens and law enforcement. She spoke with her usual calm authority, but this time there was a hint of cautious optimism in her voice. "Policies and laws are necessary," she said, "but what really changes a community is the mindset of the people who wear the badge. It's the small, daily choices that matter most. How you speak to someone, how you listen, how you treat them when no one else is watching." The room stayed quiet as her words settled. It was the kind of silence that meant people were truly thinking. Meanwhile, Miller was at the precinct reading through a new training manual on implicit bias. A few months ago, he would have rolled his eyes, maybe even mocked the material. Now, he read each page carefully. It wasn't about checking a box anymore. It was about understanding how easily bias crept into every decision he made. Later in the afternoon, Miller was dispatched to a call about suspicious activity in a neighborhood park. When he arrived, he saw two teenagers sitting on a bench with backpacks, clearly just talking. A few months ago, he might have approached them aggressively, but this time, he walked up calmly and asked, "Everything okay here?" The teens nodded, a little wary at first. Miller didn't press further. "All right, have a good day," he said simply, then left them in peace. It was a small moment, but it mattered. Across town, Angela stopped by the community center for an informal meet and greet. A young man approached her shyly. "I just wanted to thank you," he said. "People talk about what you're doing, and it gives us hope. Feels like someone finally sees us." Angela smiled warmly. Everyone deserves to be seen. That's how change begins. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Miller sat alone in the locker room after his shift. He thought about how much his approach had shifted. He didn't know if anyone else noticed yet, but he noticed, and that was enough for now. That evening, Angela returned home. She sat by her window, sipping tea and watching the city lights flicker. She thought about how one roadside stop had reminded her that even the highest office didn't shield her from bias, and yet she'd use that moment to fuel something bigger than herself. At the same time, Miller parked his cruiser near the same highway where it all began. He turned off the engine and just sat there, thinking about how one encounter had shaken him awake. They didn't know each other beyond that day. They didn't need to, because sometimes the people who change you the most are the ones you meet only once. The next day, Angela met with a group of law enforcement cadets at the academy. She had been invited to give a guest lecture on ethics and community relations. Standing in front of the fresh recruits, she could see the mix of eagerness and uncertainty in their eyes. "You are about to carry a badge that represents the law," Angela began. "But remember, your badge doesn't give you power over people. It gives you responsibility for them. Every person you stop, every hand you shake, every word you speak reflects what kind of officer you choose to be." One cadet raised his hand. "What's the biggest mistake you see officers make?" Angela didn't hesitate. Assuming. Assuming they know someone's story by looking at them. Assuming they have the right to treat some people differently. Assumptions destroy trust faster than anything else. The room was silent. The cadets were listening closely, absorbing every word. Meanwhile, Miller had been reassigned temporarily to community outreach, something he would have once considered a punishment. But now, he approached it differently. He spent the day speaking with residents, not just hearing their words, but truly listening. At one point, an elderly man approached him. "You know," the man said, "it doesn't take much for an officer to make someone feel like a criminal, even when they're innocent. One look, one tone of voice, it sticks with you." Miller nodded, feeling the weight of that truth. "You're right. I've been that officer before. I'm trying to make sure I'm not anymore." Later that afternoon, Angela returned to her office and reviewed a stack of letters from citizens. One in particular caught her eye. "Thank you for standing up for people who don't have a voice. We can feel the difference already. It's not perfect, but it's better." Angela smiled faintly. Progress was never immediate, but even small signs of hope were worth the effort. As the sun began to set, Miller finished his outreach shift and parked his cruiser by the edge of the city. He watched kids playing in a park, parents chatting nearby, neighbors greeting one another. For the first time in years, he felt connected to the people he served, not separated from them. That evening, Angela attended a quiet dinner with a few trusted colleagues. They talked about the ongoing reforms, the challenges ahead, and the work still to be done. "Do you think it's really making a difference?" one colleague asked. Angela nodded thoughtfully. "Change doesn't always look like a headline. Sometimes it's one officer choosing to do better. Sometimes it's one citizen feeling safer. Those moments matter." Across town, Miller sat in his car outside his home, reflecting on his day. He still felt the lingering shame of his actions on that roadside, but now it fueled him to keep choosing differently. Two paths, two lives forever altered by a single encounter. Because sometimes one small spark is enough to start a quiet fire of change. The next morning, Angela prepared for yet another meeting with state officials, this time to review the first measurable outcomes of the reform efforts. Complaints against unnecessary stops had dropped slightly in certain districts, still far from perfect, but a sign that the seeds she'd planted were beginning to grow. As she glanced through the data, she thought about the hundreds of faces behind those numbers. People who, like her on that roadside, had been judged before they were even given a chance to speak. Meanwhile, Miller arrived at the precinct early. He was scheduled to mentor a new recruit that day, a young officer fresh out of the academy. As they got into the patrol car, the recruit asked nervously, "Any advice for my first few weeks?" Miller paused before answering. "Yeah. Remember this. Every stop you make is someone's story. Don't be the reason it's a bad one. Treat them like you'd want someone to treat your own family. The recruit nodded, clearly surprised by the tone. Across town, Angela made her way to a local radio station for an interview. The host asked her about the challenges of reform and why she believed it was worth the effort. Because, Angela said calmly, every time someone in a position of power chooses respect over prejudice, it changes more than just one interaction. It restores a little faith. And faith in the system is what keeps a community whole. Her voice was steady, her words deliberate, reaching countless listeners who needed to hear them. Later that afternoon, Miller and the new recruit responded to a call about a stalled car on the highway. When they arrived, a nervous young man stood beside the vehicle. Miller approached with an open posture and a calm tone. "Hey there, everything all right? Need a tow?" The man relaxed instantly. "Yeah, thank you. I was worried you were going to give me a hard time." Miller shook his head. "Not here to give you a hard time. Just here to help." It was a small moment, but the recruit noticed. Afterward, he asked, "You've been doing this for years. Why do you handle things so differently than some of the others?" Miller glanced at him briefly, thinking of Angela. "Because I learned the hard way that the badge isn't about control. It's about responsibility." That evening, Angela attended a quiet community gathering. People thanked her for the progress they were seeing. A resident said, "You're changing the way they see us." Angela smiled softly. "No, I'm helping them see themselves." Across the city, Miller sat alone in his cruiser at the end of his shift. He thought about who he was before that night and who he was slowly becoming. He didn't know if Angela would ever know the difference she made, but he carried the lesson every day. And in two different corners of the same city, both of them reflected on the same truth. Real change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it moves quietly, one choice at a time. A week later, Angela was invited to speak at a statewide conference on justice reform. The auditorium was filled with public officials, community advocates, and members of law enforcement. She stood at the podium, composed as ever, her presence commanding without effort. "When we talk about reform," she began, "we're really talking about humanity. Policies matter, yes. Training matters. But what matters most is the choice each person makes in the quiet moments when no one is watching. Do you see someone's worth, or do you see only your assumptions about them?" The audience listened intently. Some nodded. Others looked down in thought, feeling the weight of her words. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Miller was sitting in a meeting with his captain. He had quietly requested a permanent transfer to community policing, wanting to continue building bridges instead of walls. The captain, surprised but supportive, agreed. "You've really changed, Miller," the captain said. "Most don't stick with it this long." Miller shrugged lightly. "Because